What differentiates what I do from the generic homeopathy is this understanding of treatment of cause, and also understanding that homeopathy and the people who promote homeopathy, they took the most difficult and least effective and consequential part of Dr. Hahnemann's system. He only did it because he said, well, sometimes you have to do it on symptoms. But that's very difficult. I don't recommend it. And even master homeopaths have a hard time doing it. But here, if you want to do it, here's how you do it. And there's a big tome on how you do that. But you can cut through all that 95% of the time or more. And you really don't have to prescribe on symptomology. It makes things very simple, but also more effective, because you're now treating cause, not just symptomology, you're treating causation.
Take us through what it's like treating an autistic kid.
Yeah, I can do that.
Welcome back to the Medicine Podcast. My name is Mimi, and I have my king, my lover, my warrior magician next to me here.
What is going on, everybody? This is Chase. I get really excited when we get to talk about a new subject on the medicine. And this is one that we know little about, but have heard of its profound impact on the lives of many. So it is with honor and excitement that I get to introduce our guest today, Rudi Verspoor. Welcome to the Medicine Podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk to people about this, because when I first started many, many years ago, I didn't think there was anybody else in the world that wanted to talk about it, but now it seems that more people are interested. Well, if we take the term homeopathy, which is fairly well known, one of the essences of any kind of science is to establish a nomenclature, like what exactly does a word mean when you use it? Otherwise, you're thinking one thing and I'm thinking another thing. So if we go back to the origin, this will really take us into the essence of why this term homeopathy, but there's a lot behind it, is so important and so critical, in my view anyway, for what we're facing today. About 200 years ago, 220 years ago, there was a revolution that nobody was aware of, you could say. It was basically buried and hidden in the history, and it took place in what was called the Romantic Revolution in Europe. And people have heard about that. They thought it was kind of an artistic movement or whatever, but it was really a very profound science movement. It was a time when free thinking in science was the norm, as opposed to today where, you're not allowed to think anymore.
Right. Yeah, what a concept.
Yeah.
All sorts of questions came up. I mean, not just in the area I'm going to talk about, but all fields. If you go back into even Wikipedia, because they don't edit those things too much, you'll discover there was an incredible amount of creative thinking going on, which has great purpose for our day and age. But if we take it in the realm of medicine, what happened is that the first scientific revolution, which we're all aware of, Galileo and Newton and all of that, the so-called empirical revolution. And they thought they had conquered more or less the cosmic world and the material world. And they, around the mid-1700s, they wanted to go into and discover the basis of life, So we could say inert nature versus vital nature. So they decided, okay, we're now going to tackle life. Big topic, but they had big egos, of course. But they were open. They went about it using the methodology they had for inert nature or material nature. And they got nowhere. And so this is what stimulated Goethe, who most people, Wolfgang Goethe, who most people see as an artist, but he was actually a scientist, a scientific researcher. And he basically stimulated a way of looking at nature that didn't involve the intellect. It involved a different knowledge organ, you could say. Mm. Okay. Now, out of that, of course, if you're interested in life, then it really comes down to, well, how do you get more of it? Or how do you prevent death or illness? Because that's all contrary to life, in a sense, seemingly on the surface. And so there was this movement within the medical profession in Germany, England, United States, and others, but mainly centered in Germany, which was the center of economic and social, cultural, and scientific development at that time. And one man, a Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, German, and he gave up on medicine. He said, it's ridiculous. We kill more people or harm more people than we help. And he basically walked away from his medical practice and only did what we would call regimen or lifestyle stuff. Open the windows, get some fresh air, get more sunshine, eat good foods. Of course, it was a lot easier back then, of course, than it is today, because we don't have the whole pollution that we have now. But nonetheless, there were still issues. And so, but he eventually had to admit, after a number of years of doing that he could only go so far. And so he had to go back into what he called medicine. Now, to understand what I mean by going back into medicine, we have to take that term medicine. Okay, what does that mean? Again, it means many things to many people. But for Dr. Hahnemann, there was a fundamental difference between what he was doing on the lifestyle side, you could say, drink more of this and less of that and whatever, and medicine. Now, we use the term regimen. You got to regiment yourself in terms of how you live your life, and you don't just take anything in. You only take in things that are good for you, etc. And medicine; those are two different things. Now, the way they differ is that they affect two different aspects of the life force. So this is this famous life force, or Lebenskraft in German, that the Germans were trying to figure out. And one of the things that came out of that, but Dr. Hahnemann was really at the center of this, was that your life force has two streams in it. And we just talk about the life force, vital force, whatever. And in the Eastern tradition, it's called qi. Mm-hmm. But qi is only one side of the thing. Most people don't realize that the Chinese and the others also talk, but not very much, because they didn't know what to do with it, a different stream called qing. And so Dr. Hahnemann said, well, there's this other stream that medicine deals with. Now, what's the difference between the one stream and the other stream? Well, the first stream he called, and this is translating from the German, the substantive power, or the maintaining power. So you're out of balance, you're not drinking enough water, you don't get enough sleep, you don't eat enough food or the right foods. And well, how do you get back into balance? Well, drink more water, get more sunshine, get some sleep. This is what in ancient Greek medicine was called the law of opposites. Mm-hmm. Makes sense, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If you're dehydrated, you got to drink more water.
Exactly. Yeah.
Me philosophizing to you about how you should live your life is not going to help your dehydration, kind of thing. So it's very practical and totally logical, and everyone gets that. Okay. So this has emerged in today's healthcare system, you could say, if we can call it that, in what we could colloquially call naturopathic medicine, or the naturopathic approach, but there's no medicine in there. Okay. Naturopathy is about establishing balance on the regimen side for this maintaining power. Okay. So you have an imbalance, you want to get back into balance. But what happens on the other side of the equation with this other stream, which is he called the generative power?
Okay.
Why is that? Because it's the power that's responsible for reproduction and creation. So the fact that your cells can reproduce, the fact that you can create is due to that power. Has nothing to do with the substantive power. Okay. Mm. It's the sexual, you could say the sexual energy in the broadest sense. Okay. Now, if something goes wrong on that side, on the generative side, it's not about an imbalance. It's, to use an analogy, if a woman is pregnant, except if you take poisons, but that gets you into the medicine side. No amount of extra exercise, sunshine, good food is going to change the fact that you're pregnant. Okay, you're that because it's different jurisdiction. Okay, so sometimes there are things that affect you on that generative side, and no amount of exercise, sunshine, water, good food is going to change that part of the equation. So that's what Dr. Hahnemann discovered. So he created a system of addressing that. Now, he resurrected something that was known by the Greeks, but they didn't touch it because it was very dangerous. Okay, it was dangerous for a reason, because it was called what is termed in Latin the law of similars. Okay, so if you're suffering from, let's say you swallowed some lead, what would the law of similars tell you? Take some lead.
Yeah.
More lead.
Now, that's totally counterintuitive, isn't it?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you take more lead? If you just swallowed lead, you're going to get sick. And that's absolutely true. But nonetheless, they recognized that that law was valid. The problem they had was dealing with dose. Okay. What dose of lead do you need to give the patient in order to cure their lead poisoning or mercury poisoning, let's say? I've done that with lots of autistic children. Well, Dr. Hahnemann realized that was the problem. So he started to take the doses that were standard in those days, which were big doses. I mean, today you think, drugs are bad. Back then, they were heavy doses. He started to dilute them in a very methodical fashion. He was a well-known chemist. He had written chemistry textbooks for physicians and students in German schools. And he systematically started to dilute. But he did it in a way that agitated the solution. And what happened is he approached, because the more he diluted, the fewer side effects he got, okay? Because the side effects are attached to the material part, okay? When he got to a certain threshold, and that threshold in chemistry in the English-speaking world is called Avogadro's number. I don't know if you've heard of it, but if you studied high school chemistry, you would have come across it at some point.
I studied high school chemistry.
So I always was intrigued by that, because there's this limit. And what it is the theoretical limit you reach. If you dilute, eventually you get to a point there are no more particles or molecules.
Sure.
From a purely chemical perspective, you have nothing but water. Okay. Now, Dr. Hahnemann knew this. He was a chemist. He knew that he was approaching this critical threshold, but he wanted to test it, and he did. And that, you could say, made medical history, because what he discovered is that you can cross that threshold and still have an effect. So suddenly we're in a totally different world, aren't we? We're not in a world of matter. We're in a world of energy. And this is a very unique energy. It's a life energy, which has nothing to do with electromagnetism, nothing to do with strong and weak nuclear forces. Okay, it's totally different energy. But it has therapeutic effects. So now he could give a highly diluted but energized dose of lead to someone suffering from lead poisoning and cure them of the lead poisoning.
Wow.
I know it sounds like magic, doesn't it? But that's exactly the world he stepped into.
So does cure in this case of the lead poisoning mean that the lead is cleared from the body?
No, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. The body wants to get rid of the lead. Okay. And it will. It'll get rid of anything that is inimical to the body. However, if you take in lead from the outside, it creates a shock to the system. The system goes into shock. A mini form of PTSD, you could say. That shock prevents the body from marshaling the resources necessary to get rid of the lead. So it kind of gets stuck in there. So we don't directly act on the lead. Chelation therapy does that. You can chelate and chelate the lead out, etc. But the thing that's missing in chelation therapy is that the shock is still there. And as long as the shock is there, it's almost impossible to get the body to get rid of all the lead. It'll hang on to it. Okay. So what the infinitesimal dose, as homeopaths would say, does is it destroys the shock because it's working on a law of resonance, similar resonance. Now, this is a well-known law. People say, well, homeopathy is crazy, etc. But it's a well-known law. It's used in sound engineering. If you put two sound waves together, they cancel each other out. So that's why they have to be very careful how they position the speakers at a pop concert or something, because of the speakers where they come together, you could stand there and hear nothing. Sound wave technology, the famous example of an opera singer singing, hitting a high note and smashing a glass, action at a distance, as it were. How did she do that? Well, that's the law of similar resonance. So she's hitting a note that resonates with the frequency of that glass. So this law of similar resonance, we're simply applying that, but using this energy coming from natural products or various other products. So we get rid of the matter and we still hang on to the resonance, the frequency. So you could say it's a law of similar frequency. So that destroys the shock. Now the body can get rid of let me give you an example, a very simple example. You might have heard it in some of the other podcasts, but it's a great example. A patient who came in, a young lady in her late 20s, I guess, and her problem was that she had high levels of mercury. And the doctors tried to get rid of it. They tried to chelate. They tried all sorts of things. Nothing. It stayed there. And so when she came in, she somehow, she said, how can I get rid of this mercury? I said, well, we have to find out why it's there. Like, why won't your body get rid of it? It should. And why didn't the chelation work? It turned out she had 6 months prior, she had had a very severe emotional shock, death of a close family relative. And that's when her mercury levels went up. Okay. Now, you could ask me later if you want, we could talk about why the body would produce mercury, because it didn't come from the outside. She had no mercury in her teeth. She was no exposure to mercury. The body produced this mercury because mercury has a very powerful effect in the body for change. So the body was trying to change. And so I treated her for the shock of the emotional trauma of the death, sudden death. And within, I think, about 6 months, the mercury disappeared, was gone.
Wow.
So that's an example of, you could say, how something that affects the generative power, which is a shock or trauma, it's not an imbalance. I'm not just a little, out of whack. There's a specific, almost an impregnation that occurs as a result of this shock. And we have to, and I don't want to use that word in a negative sense, but we have to create a therapeutic abortion because there's something in there that is not, the body really doesn't want, but it can't get rid of it. So the homeopathic medicine or the energetic medicine destroys that shock. So that's Dr. Hahnemann's contribution to this revolution, was to give us this understanding. And I don't see it anywhere. Okay. Now, having said that, you don't find it in the naturopathic side. It's all about supporting and balancing and everything else, which is fine up to a point. But no one's aware of this other side, including, strangely enough, homeopaths. Yes. Now, having said that, that brings up the topic I mentioned at the beginning of the definition of homeopathy.
Yes.
So Dr. Hahnemann invented that term from the Greek. Okay, it means similar suffering. And what it means is to find a remedy you need, a medicine, energetic medicine, based on the symptomology of the patient, which makes sense. However, that wasn't his entire system. Okay. Now, everything he wrote was in German. So not everything was translated. And what was translated was not necessarily translated well. I've done a lot of work as a historian and other areas to know that things get translated badly. I always taught to go back to the primary source. So when I started to discover this in various ways, I won't bore you with, but I went back to the source, and I was helped by a German scholar and you could say kind of Renaissance man lived in California, Stephen Decker, and he was starting to translate these documents as well. And so we got together and we were able to work up what was really going on. And what we discovered is that Dr. Hahnemann had created an entire other system that everyone had missed. Now, this was in an essay he wrote at the very beginning and didn't seem as impressive as his big tome that came out later. And so everyone forgot about it. It's a very, very profound essay. But what he said was two things. He said, you must first treat the cause. And secondly, if you can't identify the cause, then you have to treat based on symptoms.
Interesting.
Okay, so there's a very profound statement there. First, treat cause, not symptoms.
So you know, this symptom treatment, which we associate with homeopathy, probably if anybody's been into a natural grocer or pharmacy, you navigate towards the homeopathy section, you see symptom-based treatments of some kind, or
that's what exactly homeopathy is. But it's not the whole system that Dr. Hahnemann created.
This Qing, this generative drive, this generative energy that's been only of a fraction of which has been included in what we consider homeopathy today. Yes.
Now, he said cause. So cause is very simple. In his world and in mine, once you understand Aristotle's system of causation, it's very simple to identify cause. So that's not the problem. I have a map for everyone. I have a map of causation. So if you treat for cause, then you seldom have to go after the symptoms. Now, why is that a good thing? Because you have lots of symptoms. So if I take all your symptoms and I try to sort out, well, which symptoms are due to the fact that you're not eating the right food, which are due to the fact you're not getting enough water, which are due to the fact that you don't get enough sunshine, or you're depressed, or you're just overdid it the other day. Like it's almost impossible from symptomology to sort out the right remedy. So having said that, it's an unfortunate reality, but of course the homeopaths don't talk about it. But I almost gave up homeopathy because of this problem. I didn't know about this causation thing, but I almost gave up. And I went to a lecture by George Vitoukas, a famous homeopath, and I talked to him. I got an audience with this guy who was a god, on the homeopathic side. And I asked him, I said, listen, I don't get very much success. It's really depressing. And he was very honest. He said, well, half of the time I don't know what to do. So he's a master homeopath. Wow. He said, half the time I don't know what to do. And of half of those, it doesn't work. So we're down to, 15, 20, 25% kind of thing. And another very famous homeopath, I went to one of his concerts or his presentations in California, actually, and Dr. Sankaran from India. And he admitted he only got a 15% success rate. Now, these guys are the top of their game. And, but 15%, I'd be lucky if I get 5. So that's not a good success rate for any system of treatment or medicine. So I almost gave up until I, stumbled on this, and the rest is history. But with this, you can get closer to a 90, 95% success rate. Now, again, that we have to get into what we define as success, because there are some limitations there. But the key is that what differentiates what I do from the generic homeopathy is this understanding of treatment of cause, okay? And also understanding that homeopathy and the people who promote homeopathy, they took the most difficult and least effective and consequential part of Dr. Hahnemann's system. He only did it because he said, well, sometimes you have to do it on symptoms. But that's very difficult. I don't recommend it. And even master homeopaths have a hard time doing it. But here, if you want to do it, here's how you do it. And there's a big tome on how you do that. But you can cut through all that 95% of the time or more. And you really don't have to prescribe on symptomology. It makes things very simple, but also more effective, because you're now treating cause, not just symptomology, you're treating causation.
I would imagine it's way upstream, where the symptoms is dealing with downstream flooding from an upstream issue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can you go into, you've mentioned trauma and shock, and I would imagine these are associated with the cause or a cause.
Yes, they are.
Can you talk about what are these causes? Is this like a car accident you got in when you were a kid? Is it the emotional or physical abuse that that has happened in your life? What do these causes usually look like?
Okay. Well, there's three fundamental levels of causation. Well, we could say four, but the one is more difficult to get at. And the first one has to do with this physical life we're in. So yes, you're born, and you're born through a C-section. Okay, so you have drug intervention, you have physical intervention on the mother, you have the stress of it all in the hospital, and all of that is shock and trauma. Mm-hmm. Or one of your presidents used to say shock and awe. When you go to a hospital, you get shock and awe. It's very impressive, but it's traumatic.
Sure, it's the jaws of life oftentimes as your first.
Yeah, it's for emergency medicine it's great, but for normal stuff it's very interventionist and often not necessary. Then you get the fact that maybe you can't breastfeed, or the mother can't breastfeed for whatever reason, and then you get now all the early childhood vaccinations. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that, but
please go anywhere you want.
So and then you get accidents, fall off the table or the bed, and then you get a burn, and then your pet dog dies, and then we go on, and these are all accumulated traumas. Now they don't go away. They are stored. These interruptions, these disturbances of the generative power are stored in your body memory. Okay, there's a body memory, and they just start weighing down on your energy. So imagine you have an energy flow, and there's lots of shorts that take place along the line, and the energy you get at the end is not the energy that is put in at the beginning. That's what's happening to your life energy. All of these traumas bleed energy off the main line in order to maintain them, keep them from totally disturbing the system. So it's like a holding operation. So that then produces symptoms. So that's one level of causation. Now, which trauma produces which symptom, almost impossible to tell. But we know there's a chain of causation, and those symptoms are probably produced by a whole series of those causes in that chain. So that's one level, and that's bad enough for children today, especially autistic children.
Sure. The
second level is inherited, but it's not genetic. It's what you could call genealogical, or what geneticists would call epigenetic.
Okay.
It's influences that influence the gene function. My brother's a geneticist, so I talked to him a lot about that. But they recognize this now. It didn't 20, 30 years ago, but now it's very clear. So strangely, as strange as it is to say, Dr. Hahnemann actually also discovered a way to treat for those inherited patterns, those inherited traumas, you could say, but they're a different kind of trauma, ancestral trauma. Let's say I have a patient, who's Jewish, and one of the ancestral traumas she seems to be bothered by is the Holocaust, for example. But you can have traumas about ethnic cleansings, and the Hungarian had traumas about ethnic cleansing from the Huns, and the Mongols and stuff. And,
Right.
This goes back quite a ways. So I don't need to know what they are, because these are what Jung would call archetypal. And again, we don't have to waste a lot of time explaining how we came to that, but that's one level. That's the second level of causation. That's very deep. And I couldn't treat most autistic cases without going into that second level of causation. The third level is a level that has to do with conflict. And this is the level that Freud and Jung and others were trying to get into, but not very effectively. But that's the level of subconscious conflict. So you want to be successful, but you sabotage your interview. Typical classical psychological, you undermine your own success because you have a fear of success for some reason. It brings up problems in your mind, and you're not conscious of it. It's in your subconscious. So that's the third level of causation. And we have a way of treating for that, but it uses something that was developed again by the Germans and the Brits called bioresonance, but used in a very special way. The fourth level has to do with the mind and has to do with belief. So we all have beliefs, because beliefs are what we use to fill in what we don't know.
For sure. Yeah.
We don't like a vacuum, so we make something up and we hang on to that because it's very disturbing not to know something.
That's a great way to put it. We don't like the feeling of a vacuum, so we like to fill it up.
Yeah, we fill it up. And some beliefs we can give up very easily. If we're very scientifically minded, we could say, oh yeah, I used to think that, but now I'm presented with this evidence, I have to give it up. But it's rare, because most people, once they've glommed onto something, they stick with it. I'll give you an example. Let's say someone has the belief that being vegetarian is the only way you can be healthy. And that's a belief, because scientifically it's not correct.
Right.
So I could give you endless of those kinds of beliefs that I've faced with patients, but I'm about science. I'm not about belief. It's not about being for or against vegetarianism. You can be for or against for political, religious, or other reasons, but if you're dealing with science, you can't. You have to say, okay, who is vegetarianism good for?
Sure.
Good for some, but not all. And so then you're in science, okay? And then you don't care about, I had a patient who refused to eat meat, and she was always complaining about lack of energy. I said, I'm sorry, but the science tells me you have to eat some meat. Now, maybe I tried to convince her it was like, for medicinal purposes, you could say. And she finally did. She finally came in one day, and I've never thought she would, and she ate a small piece of meat, and her energy soared.
Wow.
And so then, this is hard to accept if you have a belief that, somehow this is good for the planet or this or that or whatever. But if we're talking medicine, if we're talking healthcare, we can't be guided by belief. We have to be guided by science. So that's the highest level, because that's the most difficult one. But if you carry someone through those other three levels, then you can start tackling that belief level. Otherwise, there's no point. You can't. People just refuse to deal with it. So that takes you far afield, of course. And but the key takeaway here is that the whole healthcare system, which is now divided into two parts, the conventional, what we call allopathic system, which is all about suppression, okay, because it's anti this, anti that. Okay, antipsychotic, anti-inflammatory, antihistamine, anti. Whatever the body wants to do, they're going to suppress it, because they don't trust the body. They have no real physiology. They simply have a very complicated chemistry, and they look upon the body as a machine. So inflammation's bad. It's an infection. Ear inflammation, it's an ear infection. Don't even test for it. They kill the bacteria, and it sets up a whole host of problems. But we all know that. The other side, which was you could say the reaction to that, which emerged slowly, what we call alternative medicine or the natural health field or whatever.
Yep.
But that only deals with the substantive power. That's it.
Yep.
How to balance. But how do you get rid of these impregnations? How do you get rid of these little pregnancies that your body is, you could say, burdened with, to a point that everyone that I've ever met is really a walking PTSD case.
God feels that way. It really does feel that way.
Feel that way sometimes.
It is. And so what Dr. Hahnemann gives us in the true sense, the causal sense, not this symptomological, which again isn't very effective. It can move things around, but it really isn't treating the causation. That gives us the possibility. That's why I get so excited by it. And I've written a lot about it, and even created a school to train people to do it. Of course, everything starts small and it's slow going, but that's why, to me, that is the promise and hope for the future, because you can get rid of vaccine shock, you can get rid of chemical shock, you can get rid of poisoning shock, of emotional traumas, people who suffered in massive emotional traumas. You can treat all of that in a very effective way. It takes time, but it's easy to do once you understand it and you have a map. You're not blindly guessing, what it might be. You know exactly where you are on a map, what you need to treat, when you need to treat it. The only difference, the real challenge in some cases, is case management. Because everybody's unique, I can't predict how you're going to respond. And by that, I mean your healing reaction. Mm-hmm. I don't know how deep each trauma went, how much of a disturbance it created, and I don't know how your body's going to react. Some react very violently, and you get a strong healing reaction, so you have to help them through that. But at the end of it, you come out much better, okay? Mm-hmm. It's a bit like a book distribution. I have some cases that if I published them in a book, I'd be seen as the miraculous, healer, right? Because they seem like magic, but those are few and far between, right? But I still have enough to fill a book. And then you get the main part of the bell, which is just people responding in a rather average way, and slowly the trend line goes up. They feel better. They feel their symptoms start to fade away, and nothing dramatic or rising from the dead kind of thing, but that's the way I prefer it. And then you have the other extreme where, it's like pulling teeth and everything to move these cases because they're so deeply buried. And it takes a lot of patience on the part of the person or the parent to take them through that process, particularly with autistic kids, for example. So usually I just get word of mouth. I don't go out advertising, because if they know someone who's been through that process, then they have a certain amount of trust and faith that we're going to get through that, because it can be a rough ride at times. But it's the only thing I know of in all the 30-some years I've been in this field. And I've studied many modalities. It's the only thing I know of that can address that deeper problem of causation. Everything else is kind of making things better at a certain level. It's helping your energy. It's getting rid of toxins. It's strengthening certain aspects. But as long as those underlying causes are still there, your case is just going to get worse over time. Doesn't matter what you do. So,
I have a question about, when you're speaking about emotional traumas, maybe even like birth being a trauma, maybe a child, I'll use one example here. Maybe a child was neglected emotionally and at 5 years old, and now she's 30 years old and having maybe some health issues that she might not know is tied to that initial, that emotional neglect or abuse. when she does become aware of it, how important it is to heal that and to forgive and to release and let go. I've done these practices myself where I've sort of laid in meditation and gone back and, visualized the situation, forgiven anyone who was involved, who was there. And I legitimately feel lighter when I come out of that meditation. Clearly, something is happening inside me that's beneficial. Is it possible to heal that initial shock or trauma with your own psychological, pharmacy that exists in our body, that the ability of the body to just release and let go? Can we do that ourselves, or do we need a generative power homeopathic tincture that we drop on our tongue? Like, I'm curious what this actual generative healing modality looks like, or is it something that we can do for ourselves?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. The answer is yes, you can do things for yourself. There are two aspects to that you need to keep in mind. One is the fact of how deep that trauma went. Okay. If the trauma is not deeply rooted, you can actually remove it through what we would call psychotherapeutic means. Yourself or someone helps you through the trauma, and you forgive and all this. But if it's taken root, it won't work. However, it will help you. You will feel better. And the reason you feel better is because you have discharged the energy field associated with that trauma. The problem is you haven't gotten rid of the force field associated with that trauma. So there's a fundamental difference in physics, but also in vital nature, between a force field and an energy field. Okay. So I'll give you an example. This is an excellent example. The universe always sends me these cases so they can illustrate, these points. But, and again, I mentioned in other podcasts, but this young lady came to see me, and she had 5 years previously visited a naturopath, and she had lots of symptoms. And they changed her diet and, her lifestyle, and all the symptoms went away. Great. Wonderful. She got a shock 6 months before coming to see me, and all her symptoms came back. Okay. Now, why? That was her question. She was looking for an answer. Why did all my symptoms come back? They all went away, and now they came back. So I had to explain to her the difference between an energy field and a force field. So the naturopathic treatment got rid of the energy of the trauma, but didn't get rid of the force field. Now the force field will reproduce that energy eventually. And the shock or trauma weakened her condition to a point where the force field was able to reassert itself, the force field of all of these traumas. And now, and the other thing is, she went back to the same naturopath, and they tried all the different things that they had done before that worked, but now they didn't work. So you have to ask yourself, well, why did they work before and they don't work now? And the reason is, again, because they're not addressing the causation. So in most cases, unfortunately today, it would be nice if we could all do that the way you describe. And people used to do that, before you could say the modern era. That was that's why the priest was really the physician, not a secular person, but because they take people through this whole process, soul spiritual rejuvenation and everything. So today, unfortunately, it's not the case. It's very rare that you can do that yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it and you shouldn't help yourself, because you will feel better. But what I'm telling you is you won't get rid of the force field. And that will stay, and eventually it'll either get triggered at some point, or it'll just work in a very insidious way at eating away at your life energy. And you wonder why you're now feeling more tired and things are dragging. And despite all the good things you're doing for yourself, somehow you can't seem to get over that problem. And that's because of that underlying chain of causation that is dragging you down.
So then to treat that next layer, the force field, and the real cause, what does that treatment modality look like beyond, it's resurfaced and you realize that there's still this force field attribute?
Yeah.
What does the treatment look like?
The treatment is the same, based on the same law of similar resonance. The difference is that you're basing the choice of the remedy on the relationship between a remedy and a cause. And that was one of the other things that Dr. Hahnemann laid down in an essay in 1796, is he said, for every cause, there's only one remedy. Now, that makes things a lot simpler, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a trauma of loss, death, abandonment, whatever you want to call it, there's only one remedy. If you have a trauma of guilt, embarrassment, or whatever in that category, there's only one remedy. If you get hit over the head and you get a concussion, there's only one remedy. So that makes it easier. So once I know the trauma, I know the remedy. Now, that's for the traumas in this life. When it comes to the, you could say, the ancestral trauma, that's been worked out. There are 8 ancestral patterns that you can have, and each one of them is associated with a specific remedy. So again, very simple. So I don't need to spend a lot of time, figuring out the symptoms and which symptoms need to take into account. If you go and see a classical homeopath, you might spend an hour or two while he's trying to figure out and sort out all your symptomology. I don't need more than 10 or 15 minutes with a patient to know already, can lay out the whole plan of the treatment. It's just a matter of following that plan. Now, occasionally things will come up and there's no obvious cause, because these are kind of secondary or tertiary issues off the original cause, but they kind of get an independence of their own. Then you may have to resort to the symptomological, but it works very effectively then because it's very simple and straightforward. It's not complex and confused. But yes, you can, using the same energetic medicine, but now with the relationship of one-to-one between a trauma and a remedy, you can remove those traumas very effectively.
So, Rudi, I do a lot of education around HPV, human papillomavirus, and I educate women, help women to basically heal cervical dysplasia as a result of HPV. And I've been doing this for years. Women find me from all over the world, and I'm very blessed to be able to help women and guide women in this way. But as you're talking about trauma and causes and shocks bringing to light or bringing up past issues, it's triggering something in me where I've heard women where they have HPV and they clear it and it comes back negative on their test, and they're celebrating and it's great. 2 years goes by, they have maybe another stressful event like a childbirth or a death or something, a shock, and it can pop back up on their next pap screen. And I'm thinking of, I want to help them as much as I can, and I can help them with their lifestyle and supporting their immune system, which I love doing. But I'm also thinking, like, is there a way that I can inquire with them or ask a right series of questions to maybe understand their shock and trauma that could have elicited this initial positive test. And I don't know if that's possible for me to do, not being, a homeopathic doctor or anything, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. And if you have helped or treated women with any sort of cervical dysplasia or cervical cancer, even, just your thoughts around that, and if there's anything that I can be doing to help these women further, aside from maybe sending them to you if they really need that deep help.
Well, from the, yes, I've treated lots of cases of lots of different things. There are even things that nobody ever had a name for before, you could say. But you always have to ask when something, let's take HPV as a good example. As a scientist, you always have to ask why. Why is it there? Nobody seems to ask that. Everybody just assumes, oh, you have it? Okay, now let's treat it. But I always ask why. Why do you have this? Like, God didn't make us to have HPV. So there has to be some underlying weakness, some underlying causation that lies behind why you have the HPV. Now, that applies to everything. Anything anyone can come into you with, you could say, why? Now, of course, I know the why, but the why is not so obvious. But if you want to know the why, you can say to them, many of these conditions are linked to stress. Mm-hmm. And can you go back and think in your life of things that were particularly stressful? Now, often they will be psychological stress. They could even be sexual, stress. But they could also be injections, vaccinations, anything that weakens the body's immune system and defenses will lay you open to a particular virus, you could say. Now, the word virus is just a carrier for an energy. The virus itself doesn't get you. It's the energy that it's carrying. There is a book, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. I think you can get it on Amazon. It's called Messages from the Body. Mm. And this was a psychologist, a very intuitive psychologist. I don't know where he came up with all this information, but I've discovered it's very accurate. That tells you anything wrong with your body. It'll tell you exactly what the psychological, emotional state or condition is behind it. So it gives you a clue as to what the body is expressing. And so HPV, you could look it up. I haven't looked at that for a long time, but you could look it up and it would tell you what the emotional state of mind is that is being manifest in this physical condition called HPV. To answer your second question, no, unless you actually went through the training, although technically, if you read a book about it, you'd say, oh, well, that's simple, I can do that. Technically, it is simple. The complication comes when you apply it to a living case, because you have to know the whole lie of the land in order to know when things don't go the way they're supposed to. It's like someone once said, all plans for war last until the first day of battle. Then it changes. Yeah. And it's the same in medicine. So you need rules, you need a map, you need direction, you need guidelines. But each case, you need to understand the whole of what's going on. And that's a very complex physiology, which we teach to our students, and is, as far as I know, is not taught anywhere else except in anthroposophical medicine. And that gives you a deeper understanding of why someone suddenly seems to go off the rails through your treatment. Because otherwise it's like, well, why does this happen? And you can intervene very quickly and effectively once you have the broader understanding. But so unfortunately, the answer is you have to have that training in order to start this chain of causation, because you're going to start triggering things that are hidden, that you may not know about, that they may not even know about. I had one case of a patient who called me up in the middle of the night or whatever, and she said, I can't breathe. I'd been treating her. So I can't breathe. So I talked her down and everything else. I said, when she was calmer, I said, there has to be some emotional trauma there, something hidden. Well, I can't think of anything, blah, blah, blah. I said, it's probably a secret that you're not telling. And she said, no. So 3 days later, she admitted that it was a secret. And when she told the secret, of course, it released the energy, but then we had to treat for the trauma to get rid of the force field. But again, it's, things like that. You have to kind of have the the background to be able to handle that. Now, maybe you do, but it's still better to, you could say, either refer them to someone or to go through the training yourself. But I can assure you it's very powerful and very effective for dealing with this side of the equation that is not being addressed. You know, as I say, everything you can do on the other side is of benefit. And all the people who've been treated on the other side, they do better when you start treating for the causal links. So that's good. But if you only treat on that side and don't treat for the causation, then you eventually get these things coming back under another shock or trauma, and it shows up again because you haven't actually gotten rid of it. So you think, that's why I say what you got rid of was the energy field, but not the force fields.
Gotcha. Thank you for explaining that. I mean, it seems like when you're talking about shock and trauma being related to things like guilt or I forget some of the other examples you used, but they were very like just fear, very human, just normal, what we would call the spectrum of human emotion. And it almost seems like every person needs to be treated homeopathically to get rid of, to address the force field of this initial shock.
We've all accumulated, and again, it's not so much the nature of the shock, it's how sensitive you were to that particular shock.
Right.
So that this takes us into a whole domain we could call the soul spiritual domain, which has to do with karma. And so you're set up to a certain degree to be more sensitive to certain things than to other things. You know, my parents went through the Second World War. They weren't overtly traumatized. That's just the way things were. You handled it, you know, you dealt with it. I'm not saying they weren't affected, but today you put someone through that, they would just collapse. And because we're more sensitive in this cultural epoch, you could say, than, you know, back in the Second World War. And so, but also everyone's affected differently. One thing that I might look at and say, well, that's not really traumatic, could destroy a person's life. And another person, you know, would live through something that was massive and seemingly be okay. Not that it shouldn't be treated and that there aren't consequences, but they don't fall apart. I look at some people's timelines and I don't know how they're walking and breathing. So, but they are. Right. But nonetheless, they're going to pay the price for carrying all of that. And they start, you know, that's why they come, because, oh, my energy and I've got this problem and that problem. The body's now trying to deal with this, and it'll just get worse over time until you get to the point where everyone over 60 is on 10 or 12 drugs or something, you know, because they're carrying all this baggage. So.
Can you walk us through, you've mentioned autism a couple times, and I would imagine you've got, you know, a number of success stories there. Can you maybe walk us through a success story? And if you've got autism, I think that's pretty relevant, and many people have at least one person in their life that they are familiar with that's experienced this. But take us through what it's like treating an autistic kid.
Yeah, I can do that. Of course, they're all very different. But I wrote to preface that, I wrote a book called the recovery from autism or something, or I can't think of the title now, but it's on Amazon if you look under my name and everything. And I put 5 or 6 cases in there, which are horrible cases, and took a lot of work to help them. And people think, well, why did you put those in? Because they discourage people. I said, yeah, but they show what can be done in even the most hopeless cases. Because the ones that aren't so hopeless, they're not that difficult. And so what we do with autistic cases is we start with the chain of causation. So what do they have? Well, the vast majority of these kids have 20, 30, 40 now injections. Okay. Just by removing the shock of those alone, you can produce significant improvements.
Wow.
Okay. Just by doing that. Then you get the birth traumas, a lot of birth trauma, interventions during pregnancy, even ultrasounds, which are seen as a benign thing. I have a few cases where children's speech was affected by the fact that the mother had had ultrasounds, and by removing the effect of the ultrasound, the child started speaking. So, but for most autistic cases, unfortunately, to really have a good effect, you have to go back into the genealogical baggage, and that can be a long journey. So you're talking 3 to 5 year journey, but at the end of it, you get massive improvement. Now, that doesn't mean they're all off the spectrum, because some have brain damage. I can't change that. Some have other developmental issues and concerns, like lack of oxygen, birth, or this or that I can't totally reverse. But they go from being incredibly violent and uncontrollable to being able to function. And I had one case where I say very clearly to them, look, I'm not a miracle worker. I can help, but how much, I really don't know until we start working our way through. And she said, if I just get 10% improvement, I'll be ecstatic, because she had a really tough case and she tried almost everything else. So again, the cases I tend to get are not the easy ones, because other people will help them and make them better, and they're doing that, and that's great. But the ones I get tend to be the ones that I just have one recently, where the mother tried for 3 years, almost anything, a whole long list of things, and nothing worked. And I had to tell her, yeah, but mine's going to take a while before it works too. If nothing else worked, that means the case is very deep.
Sure.
But there's nothing unusual about autistic cases. Every case, you could say, is a similar example. It's just a question of identifying. And in this case, it's just because these kids are so traumatized by the injections. In most cases, not all autistic cases. I have some that have never been injected, and they're still autistic. So there's other causes. But the biggest trigger today, look at the number of, as the vaccines go up, the 1 in 30 or whatever it is now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty clear. But I have to say, that's not the only thing that you have to clear, because they were made susceptible to those injections by their inherited tendencies. So those you have to address as well. Otherwise, the problem will come back up again as they get shocked and traumatized by going through life. So.
Definitely. You mentioned brain damage, and that there's nothing, you'd be able to do. Where are the limits?
No, I didn't say nothing. I said there's a limit.
There's a limit. There's a limit. Where are those limitations? Like, I would imagine if someone comes in and they lost their arm, there's not going to be an ability to regrow the arm. But at what point, or maybe it's just a host of, basically like excavating to find those limitations. But basically the limitations are there. We just don't know to what extent. Sure.
I'll give you an example. I've have a case of a young man who was adopted, and a case of fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay, so significant, brain impairment, reasoning impairment, etc. The father is actually a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but somehow, anyway, I don't know, he ended up with me. But I warned him. I said, there are limits. I can only go so far. He's a very violent kid, and it's just, untenable. But we've got it to a point where the violence is gone, and yet there's still some OCD tendencies, and there's still some, kind of developmental delays. But it's a far cry from what it would have been if we hadn't treated. And the brain does have the capacity to regenerate to a point. It used to be thought the nerves can't regenerate. Well, they discovered that's not true. They do regenerate, but not as fast as the liver, let's say. So the other thing in there is, and again, this is a difficult one, because it takes us normally outside the realm of medicine, but into the soul spiritual domain again, is I can't fully control all the karmic manifestations that are built into your incarnation. And we can get rid of a lot, we can transform a lot, we can progress a lot, but up to a certain point, there are certain things that are fixed, you could say. There are certain spiritual states that are fixed, and you just have to go through them. So, those are the limitations. Of course, the physical ones, if you lose an arm, I can't help you regrow the arm kind of thing. So.
Right. Beautiful.
Thank you for that explanation. Do you work with people that need help from you? Do they need to come see you in person? Do you need to be around them, or do you work remotely with people?
I only work remotely. I used to work in a clinic, but because I started treating out of the blue autistic cases, and once you get a few successes, and everybody wants
That
to
community.
Yeah, that's a tight-knit community.
It is, and that's great, but they wanted to drag their kids through airports and to come and see me. I said, that's a trauma. I don't want those kids re-traumatized. So I developed a way to do it remotely. And then eventually it got to a point where I thought, well, I can do this for everyone. Why do I have a fixed place? Because it doesn't matter where I am or traveling or visiting, I can do, or like I'm talking to you, I can do this. And it's easy enough. I don't need to see the child. It doesn't add anything to see the child. What I need to know are the traumas, and the rest I have the map for. So once I get that, and the parents simply report on, how they responded and whatever, and as long as we're on track, we just take the next step. So yes, all my patients are basically remote. So anybody can access me or the clinic, or there are other, you could say, practitioners. The system we call Heilkunst, which is the German term that Hahnemann used, as opposed to homeopathy. Homeopathy is just a small part of Heilkunst. Heilkunst just means the art of medicine, basically. And so there are other people I've trained over the years, who do this as well, and they all work remotely. So I'm not the only one. That would be pretty sad. That's why I set up a school, to do that, because I'm not going to be around forever. But yes, anyone, I have patients in England, Spain, Australia, India, whatever. So
that's great to know. I'm sure there will be definitely some people listening who are, interested in learning more or potentially working with you. My next piggyback question on that is, Chase and I don't have any like major diseases, ailments. Generally, we're both very healthy. Generally, a lot of the people listening to this are very healthy. They feel good from a day-to-day basis. We have little things here and there, a headache here, constipation here, indigestion here, whatever it is. But for people who are looking to optimize their health, like on every level, I'm thinking like I've done some of the meditation work. I've done some of the psychic work on myself, going back and doing my best to forgive and heal and release from maybe some of these emotional traumas from childhood, or even adulthood. But I've never done what you're talking about with an experienced practitioner. Could we, and I think I already know the answer, but I would love for you to spell it out. We, as people who want to optimize our health, what could that look like working with someone like you or someone trained under you?
Well, ideally, I'd want everyone to come to me before they get sick.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it would be preventative medicine as opposed to, catch-up medicine. So yeah, I encourage people to get treated, even though they supposedly, don't have health issues. But all those little things you mentioned, constipation, headache, etc., they're just little things now, but they're warning flags. And if you don't remove all of these things, they will start to become more and more important as you get older, particularly as you pass the 40s and 50s, and you get into these things start to rear their head. And then suddenly something will pop up and out of seemingly nowhere, and you'll have this serious condition. And it's like, well, where did that come from? Why do I have that? I've looked after myself. I've been healthy. I've done all this work. And, where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from all of these hidden subterranean causes that you've managed to mask, you could say, by all the good work you've done, which is great. But nonetheless, it's there. And eventually, as your kind of reserve energy, your life energy starts to decline as you get older, it has a greater chance to manifest. So we just take someone. I had a lady that came in and she had no problems, supposedly no problems. So I just want to be healthier. I said, wow, so that's great. I wish everybody, were like that. So we took her through, And she had a few reactions. She had some healing things, or things brought up that she had forgotten about, or, were buried in her memory or whatever. And we got rid of all the ancestral baggage and everything else. And so that's a kind of preventative treatment. And yeah, it's easy to do. It's very simple. And it's the same path. You still have to give me all your traumas, even though you supposedly dealt with them. But as I pointed out, you haven't gotten rid of the force field. The force field's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you will progress through it very easily because you have done all this great work otherwise. And you won't have big healing reactions and detox reactions and everything else. You just kind of sail through. But you'll find a level of inner soul spiritual peace and contentment that is seemingly subjective, but it's really objective, and isn't dramatic, but you get the sense of being much more solid, more, you could say, more grounded, more incarnated. You're less having to, how should I put it, consciously regulate yourself in the world, because you just deal with it automatically. As now I need to, be careful what I say and speak in a nice voice. And, but if you've got hidden anger, I can tell you all women have a lot of hidden anger, at least all the ones I've treated, even if they don't admit it. It's the nature of being female. You get so suppressed, and being female, you can't express that anger usually. So it comes out, and then afterwards you feel so much better, because despite the fact that you may feel balanced, there's something in there that is creating a tension that requires effort. And when you get healthy, you get more effortless activity, more effortless action. So anyway, it's just qualitatively different. It may not be quantitatively different, but it's qualitatively different. But
it seems like you're a talk therapist as well. I would imagine you hear the wildest things, and I would imagine that's such a big part of a healing journey altogether. And it's so much what's missed is even just having someone who feels like an ally as your health practitioner, and the ability to be able to share things that were traumatic for you, if you're conscious of them. And then kind of the next layer would be even subconscious traumas, being able to unearth them or excavate them in some way. So, an example I'm thinking is even if someone was to, work with you regularly and they came in and said, hey, I've got another cold, head cold, stuffy nose. Are you at a position where you take them through the same level of protocol, or are you like, go out and get some sunshine, get some sleep, take some vitamin D? And
well, yeah, once you've gone through the chain of causation, now mind you, there's a long chain, so it depends on what's coming, but we treat acutely, but we also then shift the emphasis to the other side in terms of lifestyle. Yes. But what I've discovered is that until people are really healthy, they really won't do the lifestyle changes that are required. Or if they do, they either fall off the wagon, or it's a lot of work to get them, to keep them on it. So let's take an addiction, for example. So everybody knows the 12-step program and everything else, and all these addiction recovery programs. And they're very good and very useful, and they definitely help. But the problem is that we're left with the fact that the addiction is still there. Okay. So to me, that's not a success if you're constantly struggling against this addiction. So everyone has an addiction, even if they don't know what it is, but there's something that they can't avoid because their body needs it because of some imbalance or some illness. In my case, it was sugar. I had a sugar addiction.
I think in my case, it's Chase. I'm addicted to Chase.
Great.
It doesn't matter. It could be supposedly a healthy thing, but there will be an addiction. I had another patient who was addicted to running. Of course, well, it's very healthy to run, but he was addicted. So that's not healthy. So if you treat through this chain of causation thing, you actually get rid of the addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Not there anymore. It's not a matter of fighting it or making sure you don't get into temptation or this or that. You have absolutely no, you could put me in a sugar shack, a candy store. It wouldn't bother me. I have no interest really. Doesn't mean I don't eat things that are sweet, but it's just, occasionally want just something. We need some sweet in our life, whether it's honey or maple syrup or this or that. But before, if you had put me on a desert island without any sugar, I would have gone crazy. I think I would have gone psychotic. So you have to get rid of the addiction. And that, now, for someone coming in, you have to determine, is it just simply an imbalance? Yeah, maybe they've got congestion because they had a little too much wine and ate a few too many Aunt Martha's candy tarts or something at Christmas. And now the body's trying to detox. Okay, let's help you detox. That's fine. And the regimenoside becomes all that much easier and much more effective. And so I have lots of patients, just to give you an example, because it's very common, who, let's say, go to a chiropractor for adjustments constantly. It helps, but then they have to go back, and they have to go back, and then you have to go back. But if you go through this treatment, now you can go once every 2 weeks, once a month, once every 3 months, once every 6 months, maybe once a year for a tune-up. It's a difference, because the things that were causing you to go out of alignment, these subluxations, as they call them, aren't there anymore. And so it stays. And even chiropractors I know have told me, now if I do an adjustment, it holds. Because what was pushing it. Sure. So you do need chiropractors, you do need, these other modalities. It's not that they're not useful. It's just that they're going to do a heck of a lot more good if you can remove the underlying causation. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. It's just, I have so many questions in my head, and it's just so fascinating.
It's so fun.
I'm just loving this. And so this is sort of a selfish question, but when you're talking about ancestral traumas that maybe the person is aware of, or maybe they're not even aware of, it's subconscious.
Mostly they're not. No, they're not.
So say I were to come see you and there's this ancestral trauma, and say the reason I'm coming to you is because I want to optimize my health. I'm not really feeling much, but Chase and I are looking to become parents in the next year. And I want to optimize my body, my health before I take on this stress of carrying a child. Okay, so great. If you address any maybe ancestral trauma in my lineage, in me, and it's successful, does that then stop with me as before I, conceive and have a child?
Up to a point. Okay. I was going to ask you that. I didn't know if you had children already or if you were going to have them, but that's another good reason to go through this treatment before you have children. I wish all parents could do that, because you would definitely minimize the baggage the child brings with them. Having said that, not all baggage is ancestral. Some of it is karmic. Okay. And that can't be taken away, because that has to be there in order for you to do your journey. But it's a heck of a lot healthier to go through life without the unnecessary baggage and only the necessary baggage. So I put it this way, you want to avoid unnecessary suffering, but from a soul spiritual perspective, you need to go through a certain amount of necessary suffering. Because that's what makes you grow, right? I mean, if you put your child in a bubble, they're going to die.
Right.
Yeah.
They have to, bump against the world, as it were. So yes, it would stop all the stuff that is, you could say, not baked into the cake, that is just there, then doesn't need to be there. And it makes a big difference. Even general homeopathy over the last 200 years has noticed that people who get homeopathic treatment, and we're talking about the more traditional one, have noticed that the children are much healthier. And I've noticed that in all my patients, of course, is the ones that have children afterwards are much healthier. The other thing that helps is they're now conscious enough to try to avoid things like drugs and vaccinations and other
things. I was just going to say the woman who is more inclined towards homeopathy is probably not inclined towards things like
Exactly.
vaccines and excessive medications and
Or
things
they've
like
seen the negative effects on one child and they want to avoid them for
Right.
the next child. So overall, definitely much healthier and improved, but I can't say it removes everything
Right.
because it doesn't. Some of it is so spiritually baked in, you could say. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That's definitely something I think of often, which is like, what's the healthy level of exposure to stress,
Stressors,
and stressors? Because we all we reflect back on our life and we think of these challenging times, or actually rather we think of these times that have been the most profound learning opportunities or moments of change. And we think back and they're oftentimes on the back end of something that was very challenging or very stressful. And so, yeah, there's that kind of like, going into the gym, you want some level of tear in the muscle fiber itself such that you can recover and grow back with hypertrophy and strength, but you don't want to tear the bicep completely.
exactly.
Yeah. I'd love to give you a few minutes to, I would assume you come across many myths and misconceptions as it pertains to homeopathy, and give you a few minutes to debunk or talk about, some of these myths or misconceptions that you might see in the homeopathy space.
Well, I mean, coming from the conventional medical system, homeopathy is just debunked as a placebo effect or something. The way I address that is that twofold. Okay, one, if I grant you that it is placebo and I get a 95% success rate, that's a pretty powerful placebo.
Yes.
What's wrong with that?
Right.
Right.
So that's one answer. The other answer is it works on infants and animals, and the conventional science says they don't respond to placebo. So that's the way I deal with it. Now, they still won't accept it because they don't accept anything that's not material. They don't accept the action of this kind of energy working at a distance, even though I can give you lots of examples. But they have a belief system, and you can't penetrate that belief system. It's like the scientists refusing to look at Galileo's telescope, to look at the moon or something. So that's one, problem. The other comes from, you could say, just people generally who have maybe a more fundamental belief system. In our country, mostly Christianity, but could be Islam or others. And this is just New Age. New Age stuff. I mean, in California, I guess they accept that, but many other people just see it as flaky.
Right.
And, whatever. It's New Age, and we can dismiss it, and it's from the devil.
Yeah.
I've heard that. So what I say to them is, well, this was brought up by a doctor, an MD, over 200 years ago. Nothing to do with New Age. And once I explain the background, then they can see it. And I explain the science behind it. I say it's very scientific. So that's how I deal with it. But beyond that, I don't get too many objections unless you can think of some that you've come across, and I'd be quite happy to address them.
I have seen from some mainstream conventional type people where CNN is CNN's biggest fan, and the more vaccines the better, this type of attitude, that there's no clinical research, there's no real data,
Okay.
data driven, clinical research driven type.
Okay. Well, one, that's not true. It does exist. It's just that they don't accept it because, it's easy to say, oh, no, that doesn't meet our standards. The problem here is twofold. One is they're using the homeopathy, okay, which is symptom-based. It's seldom effective.
Right.
But what they're testing for is one homeopathic remedy, let's say belladonna, against fevers. Well, it didn't really work that well. Well, belladonna is one of 400 or so different remedies you could use for fevers. So if you're just using belladonna, you're not going to find all that many cases that respond or correspond to belladonna based on the symptomology. So they're comparing apples and oranges. Their model doesn't work. But the second answer I give to people like that is, what you've come up with is this double-blind randomized clinical trial. I studied the history of that double-blind randomized clinical trial, and it is effectively useless, about as useful as the COVID-19 test. Like the inventor of the COVID-19 test said, it was never intended to, detect infection. So the double-blind randomized clinical trial was never intended to measure efficacy of a drug. It was for research purposes. And the reason is, and I have this from a pharmacist who's also a pharmacologist, herbalist, who engaged in many of these clinical trials, that once you narrow it down based on all the criteria, because you have to try to get, you can't have too many differences in the people. They have to be more or less similar. He says, effectively, you've got very few people. So those trials are run many a times on few people because everybody else gets excluded for one reason or another. Plus, they don't take into account idiosyncratic effects. Plus, they X out ones that they determine arbitrarily. Well, we won't include that because we don't think that really had anything to do with the drug. It was a death or something. So, when you get down to it, it's very suspicious in terms of, saying that this is a measure of a drug's effectiveness. And the other thing I throw back is with the placebo. As I say, most of your drugs operate on placebo. And there was an example. I was talking to a parliamentary committee up here in Canada when they were looking at natural health products, and the Doctors Association were against allowing these natural health products, etc. And they claimed that these products were dangerous or whatever. They had no evidence of it. They just claim it. But what came out of that discussion was, and the doctor was trying to make a point, that they're constantly dealing with side effects. Like, they're proactive to deal with side effects. They had to admit they had a lot of side effects, and said, well, I'll give you an example. We had a drug that had some, many side effects, and it was building up, and its effectiveness was going down. And we then worked on another drug, and we introduced this other drug. And the moment we announced it, and he said this, I don't think he knew what he was saying. He said, the strange thing was the effectiveness of that drug dropped from 50% to 30%. Because now people thought, oh, it doesn't work because there's this new drug that's better and it works. So this so-called effectiveness, the way they were measuring it, had dropped in the same drug. So, it's the conventional medical system. If you want to talk about something that's built on magical thinking, that's
I love that.
Well said.
Yeah. Well, a follow-up question to the double-blinded, randomized trial. That's sort of considered, and I've even used this language, that's sort of considered the gold standard of research.
Yes.
If that maybe isn't, in your opinion, how do you see proper research being done? Like, if you could snap your fingers and, wave a magic wand, what's a better way in your eyes?
Well, first of all, you have to, like in any science, you have to start on the basis of law. Okay. Now, Dr. Hahnemann, being a doctor recognized in his day, but nothing has changed today, that there is no science. What you have is empiricism. So they test something. Let's test something and see if it sticks and see if it works. And we have this hypothesis, let's test it. But there's no understanding of natural law. There's no understanding of the law of opposites, the law of similars. Mostly they give the law of opposites without knowing it. And sometimes they give the law of similars, like when they give amphetamines to hyperactive kids. Sure. That's the law of similars. And so if you don't start with law as your basis, then everything is just empiricism. And you're just measuring it, and it's rather arbitrary and subject to all sorts of corruption. So I'd say, first of all, you have to understand the law. Then secondly, you have to, you could say, understand jurisdiction, and you have to understand certain distinctions. So we use the term healing, Other people use the term cure, like the medical system, and yet their medical dictionaries basically admit they can't cure. They just manage and treat. So if something is out of balance, you can heal it. That's the regimen side. If something is affecting the generative power, you have to cure it. And that has to do with the law of similars using this law. Now, then you get into the dose. So you have to accept that there is this other energy. So I don't see that there would be a testing system that would work in their mind unless they're willing to accept all of those understandings of how it works. Now, once you understand that, then you can very easily test it. So, for example, if I say to you that this woman has this level of mercury because, in my estimation and assessment, she had this trauma, and that dated from that, and there's nothing else I can see that would justify that. There's no exterior mercury, etc. Everybody agrees to that. So, okay, here's a great case. I'm saying that this remedy will remove that trauma, and I'm then predicting that the mercury will disappear. Okay. Now, we can test that, right? So we give her the remedy, controlled conditions, as it were, measure the mercury over a period of months, and see if I'm right. Mm-hmm. Well, there you have a test, but it's a test based on law and principle. It's not just a random, well, let's just try this and see who it works in. It only works in those people who have mercury as a result of a specific trauma related to grief. Mm-hmm. Because if it's a trauma related to a vaccine, that remedy won't work. It won't get rid of the mercury. So, in that sense, you have to have a total rewriting of the understanding of science. And I wrote 2 books that are on Amazon about this scientific revolution, and it kind of lays all that out, that we need a totally different science, a totally different physiology. So, for example, we need a dynamic chemistry to accept and understand. And there is evidence out there, people have talked about this, but of course they ignore it, that your body can actually produce almost every substance in the periodic table. So much of the mercury, lead, arsenic, other things in your body aren't coming from outside. I'm not saying some of it isn't, because we're getting poisoned to a certain degree, but your body can produce all of these things. We don't have an understanding of the dynamics of metabolism, let's say. It's so complex. So, well, take some vitamin D, take some vitamin C, take some B vitamins. Do you know what you're doing? You're like, an Australian Aborigine in a nuclear plant. It's not going to go well, because you have no idea of the interaction and relationships between all these nutrients. So I've tested this many times. And for example, I have low iron constitutionally. That's one of my karmic issues, is low iron. Pump me full of iron doesn't change the fact that I have low iron. I've been treated through this process, doesn't change the fact that I have low iron. That's one of those karmic states that I have to live with. I have low vitamin D, and yet I don't have any problems related to vitamin D, but by their measure and their supposed statistical ranges, I have low vitamin D. Pump me full of D, put me in the sunshine, doesn't change my vitamin D levels. So again, my body doesn't want more vitamin D, because there's certain idiosyncrasies there that doesn't fit their specific, you should have between this range. Yeah. You could be in that range and be very sick, because you need way more. And so there's a real, how should I put it, ignorance when it comes to how the body works. And they just think they can control it through drugs. We'll control this pathway, because what they do is they effectively poison a pathway that is producing the symptom. So they kill the messenger, and then the symptom's gone, problem solved. The fact that you give a child steroids for their eczema, and 2 years later they've got asthma, they don't see any connection between those. They've noted it's kind of strange that children who take steroids tend to suffer from asthma more frequently, but they don't connect the fact how the physiology works, that you've driven this problem from the skin into the lungs. There is a hierarchy of the organs in the body. And if they give steroids with the asthma and everything else, it's going to go into kidneys, and then you get kidney failure. That pattern's been shown as well. So we have to have a real revolution of knowledge about, you could say, what constitutes health, what constitutes illness, and how you treat for it. And absent that, it's just purely empirical, even on the naturopathic side, unfortunately, because, they give you a bunch of supplements to take. And how do they know? How do they know what the dosage should be? It's just all seat of the pants stuff. You should have roughly, X international units of this. And but which kind of vitamin C? Right. You mean the vitamin C called ascorbic acid? That's not vitamin C. Right. That's just ascorbic acid. Why don't you just eat some rose hips? And then at least you're protected by nature, because eventually you get fed up with eating rose hips, and that's your clue that you don't need any more rose hips. Or pineapple, or something else. You can only eat so many, but you can pop a lot of pills before your body gets the message and you're overdosing. And not only are you overdosing, you're causing imbalances in other things, because there are very intricate relationships between the different nutrients and also the minerals. So, the blood test shows you're low on zinc or, potassium. So we'll give you more zinc or calcium or potassium. You could actually make things worse. I give you many, many examples that we're just kind of practicing empirical medicine, empirical, health, because there's no understanding of science behind it. Even naturopathic medicine, so-called, they study allopathic physiology, and they put a veneer of kind of some vitalism on top of it. But that's not a really deep understanding. The more I understand, the less I want to intervene, because, it's like, I don't want to intervene unless I know exactly what I'm doing. And the advantage of the law of resonance is you can intervene, and it's literally a surgical strike. That's it. It just takes out what doesn't belong there. It doesn't touch anything else. Well, can you say that of many other substances? This chemotherapy, I just want you to go to the cancer cells. Don't touch anybody else along the way. It just doesn't work. But the arrogance that they can somehow manage that. So that's, to me, is not science. That's just empiricism. Again, if you don't have science, you're stuck with empiricism, because we've got to do something. Well, let's try this. We think this might work, or we've read about, or someone suggested this could be useful. It's like ivermectin, right? This is the big thing now for COVID or whatever. It works, and even in cancers, to the extent that the body's riddled with parasites. Sure. Because it's an anti-parasitical. So it's going to really help you. It's going to take that parasitic load off your system, help you fight the COVID or whatever it is, and help you fight the cancer. But it's not a cure for cancer, because it's not addressing all the things that cause the cancer. It's only addressing one secondary, subsidiary aspect of it. So again, to understand that, you have to have clear understanding of the laws and principles and science behind it. So when we're talking, we can say, there's nothing wrong with treating for the parasites, but don't pretend that that's treating the cancer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Helping. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying we need to be very clear about what we're doing. Otherwise, you get all these, it's a cure for cancer. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's just so powerful, that the delicacy to intervene is just definitely gonna hang on to that from this conversation today. And thank you so much, Rudi. This has just been fascinating. This is so interesting to me, and this is so cool. There's such a layer of just awesomeness to the fact that we are here. We don't really know what we're doing in a lot of ways, but that there are alternative approaches to figuring it out that have what seems like a significantly higher ceiling for discovery than it would be through these mainstream routes of trying to deal with our pains, for lack of a better term. And I'm just really inspired to look into this more. I'm really, really just fascinated by it, and grateful for you for the work that you've been laying into this now for decades.
Well, I can't take credit for it all. I mean, there are many people came before me, and this gentleman that I worked with, Stephen Decker, he brought up a lot of this stuff for me. I really have just developed the therapeutic application of it in many ways. But again, my abiding interest through my life has always been science, you know. So I don't accept anything unless it has a scientific basis. Now, people say, oh, homeopathy, that's not scientific. I beg to differ. It's actually very scientific, whereas allopathic medicine that prides itself on its science is not science at all. So that's a whole other field of philosophy, you know, in terms of what science represents. But if you have an interest in science, yes, you want to start on a journey of doing things scientifically. Otherwise, you're just in, well, let's throw this at the wall and see if it sticks method. And you may get success with that and with a certain category of patients because they're the ones that need what you're giving and gives them relief. But you also need to be aware that it only goes so far. And I have to accept what I do only goes so far. You know, there's a soul spiritual dimension here I can deal with. That's not my purview, you know. So, but at least proceeding scientifically, then you're growing in mind and consciousness. And that is the name of the game, really, is to know more and understand more. It's not how many people we can help. That's nice. But if we can increase knowledge and understanding, you can help subsequent generations. Otherwise, it's just, you know, as I say, it only goes so far, the empiricism.
Yeah, I say this often, and I it's kind of one of my life mantras when I'm having a hard day or not feeling motivated to do one thing or another. Like in today's modern society, if we want to be robustly healthy, not just getting by, but robustly healthy, almost like you're an outlier, we have to do things. We get to do things that the average person, the lay person, most people are not going to do. Because when you look out in the world and you see how much obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, all of the ailments that are so common, it's so common, it's not even like a surprise when someone close to you has a diagnosis like this, unfortunately. If we don't want to experience that and we want to be robustly healthy, we get to do things that most people are not going to do. And this is where I feel really inspired by what you've shared today, because this feels like one of those things that can be so helpful for different people who have gotten no real answers in their life. No matter how many naturopaths or integrative physicians that they've seen, this could be a really wonderful opportunity and option for people out there where this is, you know, resonating. And certainly it's resonating for me. So yeah, I just want to say, like, I think the full picture of homeopathy that you're talking about, you know, addressing the cause, the initial trauma or shock, not just the little tinctures that you get at the grocery store, right? That's not what we're talking about. That's not what you're talking about.
No, those are useful, but again, you need to understand the limitations for them.
Yeah.
Where can people find you and find more information about you and the work that you do?
Well, I think we have a clinical office, reception at homeopathy.com. Also have a website called myhealthplan.center, which lays out our plan of treatment so people can see what it involves in the broad scope of things. And you can go there. And those are the main areas. We have a website called homeopathy.com. We got that many, many years ago. But
what a snag.
That's a great website.
He gave it to us because he saw what we were doing.
Cool.
He didn't want to do it anymore. So, you know, that's another one that can just go to that website. But it's there's also the International Heilkunst Association, IHA, I'm not sure what their website is, but you could look it up. Just type in International Heilkunst Association, and it has a listing of practitioners who do what I do. So I'm not the only one who does that. So, if they want someone else, I know some women don't like working with men. So sometimes my wife will treat them, or other, women who've been through the program will treat them. So there's options, but it definitely requires an understanding that health and illness is not just skin deep, that there's some deeper things that you need to work on. And it's a journey. And it's not just a matter of making things go away. It's a matter of transforming yourself to get, as you say, this robust health, because the next decade we're going to go through, it's going to try men's souls, as it were, and bodies. And if you don't have the health to deal with it, psychologically and physically, a lot of people are going to die. So.
Mm-hmm.
There's the call to action
Yep.
right there.
We'll put all those links in the show notes, guys, and definitely take some time to check that out. I know we will be.
Absolutely.
We will absolutely
100%.
be following up. I'm definitely lit up by this, and probably have a million more questions for you, but we'll table it for today. Rudy, thank you so much. What a blast.
Well, thank you for taking the time to even talk to me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, honestly, this was one of my favorite conversations that we've done on the podcast, and we've had over 200 and close to 50 now. So
wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much
you.
for your work and your dedication, your commitment to just helping people. It is really meaningful work, and we are so grateful for it.
Well, thank you. You guys take care.
Yeah.
You guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for hanging out with us. Check the show notes for all of the links, and we'll talk to you next time. Go spread some light. Okay, bye.